Good evening, folks, and welcome back to day number 35 of the Bible in 365. Today we are taking a look at Leviticus 13, starting in verse 40, and going all the way to Leviticus 14, ending in verse 57, which happens to be the end of the chapter. We've got a lot to talk about, folks, so you know the drill. We're going to get started. All right, folks, so yesterday we ended off in chapter 13 of Leviticus. We were talking essentially about infections, in particular skin diseases, and what could have possibly been leprosy. So essentially at the beginning of chapter 13, it talks about this. It talks about if someone has various signs of having infectious skin disease, and how they would have to come before the priest, and the priest would examine it and pronounce the person clean or unclean. Then they would have to go through an entire process for the priest to examine them to determine the extent of whether or not this was serious or not, and whether or not it was contagious or infectious. It gives us different information about if someone had a spot, whether it was like reddish white and shiny, or if they had a boil, and all these different symptoms essentially to determine what type of disease they might have had and the severity of it. It talks about burning skin and raw flesh and scar. And so essentially it's going through all these different scenarios. And the big concern here is that the people are clean before God, but also that they're not spreading disease amongst the people. We saw lots of times these people had to be quarantined in order to see whether or not it was infectious or contagious. And what's pretty crazy is when we pick up in verse 40, it talks about baldness and whether or not someone has a sore on their head, whether or not that correlates with skin. But what I am particularly like about this passage is in verses 45 through 46, once again, within chapter 13 of Leviticus, it tells us that any person with a serious skin disease, they had to wear torn clothes, they had to leave their hair loose and unbrushed, they had to cover up their lips and yell out, "Unclean! Unclean! Unclean!" And so as long as anyone had any sores, they were determined to be ritually unclean, and they had to go through this process. They had to live alone and live outside the camp because they were scared if this was airborne, they didn't want to spread it. So it tells us kind of the type of life that someone might have endured if they had an infectious disease, skin disease in particular. Now, in verses 47 through 58, it tells us a little bit more about mold or a fungus, kind of like mildew. It talks about essentially if this is on a fabric or cloth or found in the house, what people have to do. They have to inform the priest about it. The priest has to come examine it. They kind of have to quarantine the home for 7 days, see whether or not it spreads. If it spreads, they have different situations, which could entail them burning down the entire house or burning up the garments, or if it doesn't spread, they could just rip it off and rip off the part of the garment that is infected, and then they'd be able to patch or use that. Now, essentially, sometimes they could wash the garments, or other times they had to throw them away or burn them. Now, moving forward to Leviticus chapter 14. Within Leviticus chapter 14, essentially it tells us the rules about skin disease and how priests were to deal with those situations. So God told Moses and Aaron that he was giving Canaan to the Israelites, but he said that he might cause mildew to grow in some of their homes. And so God offered guidelines to them for situations like that. So if a person found mildew in their home, they were instructed to inform the priest. Before the priest could inspect the home, they had to take everything out. If the mildew was green or red, the priest had to quarantine it once again for 7 days. If he came back after the 7 days, it was still there, then the owners had to tear out the stones, replace them with new stones. It also talks about the cleansing of people with infectious diseases. So after a person was healed, they would have to be pronounced ceremonially or ritually clean. So they would come before the priest, and The priest would have to examine them outside the camp, once again, because they didn't want, to take the risk of them coming into camp and infecting people. The priest would examine them there, and if they were healed, then they had to make a sacrifice. This included 2 birds, cedar wood, hyssop plant, and a red cloth, essentially. So the priest had to kill one of the birds, and then the other bird, along with the wood, the cloth, and the plant, was dipped into the dead bird's blood. And then the blood was sprinkled on the person 7 times before the priest announced that person was made clean. Then they would take the living bird, throw it into the air in an open field, and set it free. Kind of to show, hey, the sin of this person has left. Or the uncleanliness has left the camp. They are now free, and so they'd be welcomed back into the camp. And so it's this entire ritual process that they have to go through to determine, hey, they're now fine to join the others. And so we see these safeguards are in place for Israel. That way, they're not going to die off from some disease. And so really it is not a harsh thing that God is asking, but it is something that is instilled for the protection of the Israelites. It is here at the end of chapter 14 that we end our reading for tonight. If you'd like, please join me tomorrow for day number 36 as we take a look at Leviticus chapter 15 beginning in verse 1, and we're going to explore all the way to Leviticus 18:18. All right, folks, as always, God bless.